Hello and welcome to this digital thinking on Amazon. My name is Alexi Mostrous. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise. Thank you so much for coming. This is a great time for us to hold the thinking on Amazon because next week Tortoise is going to publish a week-long investigation into Jeff Bezos's company. It's our second installment in our Tech Nation series, which aims to look at the biggest tech companies as if they were nations, as if they were countries rather than companies. And this is because we feel that the decisions that they make are now so significant that they would benefit from being looked at as a nation state rather than as a narrowly defined corporate entity. So check out next week. We're going to be looking at Amazon's constitution, its leadership, its foreign policy, and hopefully it'll be a really refreshing way of looking at one of the world's biggest companies. So it actually ties in really nicely tonight with what a thinking is, which is it's not a panel discussion. It's an exercise in batting a really complicated idea around for an hour, hearing for as many people as possible. And then the idea is to kind of take that knowledge and supplement our own journalism with it. So the one rule is no questions. We want to hear your point of view, your experience, and hopefully we can integrate some of what we hear tonight into our reporting next week. So if you have an indiscreet anecdote about Amazon, then please don't hold back. There are a couple of ways to contribute to the conversation. One is you can raise your digital hand. If you go down to the bottom of the Zoom window and you press participants, then you'll get the option to raise your hand. That way I will see who wants to be admitted into the conversation. If you raise your blue hand, then you've got a point to make, and I can kind of come to you and hear what you've got to say. And the other way to do it is to engage with the chat function directly below. My colleague, Merricky Mills, will be hosting the chat and she'll flag comments to me, which I can bring into the conversation. Okay, so let me introduce our guests. We've got Alice Enders. I think that she's just about made it onto the call. She's the head of research at Enders Analysis. We've got Franklin Foyer. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic and the former editor of The New Republic, and Zachary Karabell, who is an author, columnist, and an investor. So I just wanted to start by looking at Amazon's response to COVID-19. In April, Jeff Bezos wrote to shareholders and he quoted Dr. Seuss. The quote was, when something bad happens, you have three choices. You can either let it define you, you can let it destroy you, or you can let it strengthen you. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind putting up your blue hand, raising your hand, if you think that COVID-19 is going to strengthen Amazon, and keep your hand down if you think that it's going to weaken Amazon in the long run. Okay, so if we just scroll down, most people, I think so far, there's a lot of blue hands going up. Maybe it looks like about 50-50, but there are more people voting. So, okay, let's turn, Alice, are you there? Can I come to you, or would you like a couple of minutes? Alice, I think you might be on mute. Let me, okay. Yeah, are you okay?
Am I muted?
I can hear you.
Here?
No,
okay,
I can hear you. Hi, it's quite unfair of me to come to you first because you only managed to join just at the last minute. So sorry to kind of rush you into a question, but I just wondered, as an economist, you know, Bezos has had to upend his business model. He has had to jettison his fundamental promise of 1 or 2 day delivery on Prime. He's had to make over 150 process changes to his company to even start to bear the weight of the increased orders from COVID. From an economical perspective, from an economics perspective, do you think that, what do you think the risks and what do you think the opportunities are for Amazon in this pandemic?
Okay, well, may I just say, let's just let's just focus for 1 minute on the magic of marketplace as a flex factor for consumer demand. I think the extraordinary reactivity of marketplace and the, with the issues we know in the warehouses, in the international supply chains and so on, with the issues around, of course, halting delivery of certain lines that were considered non-essential. The fact is, what we saw in Amazon's results was an extraordinary opportunity. In the UK, the ONS reported retail sales for the month of April, the only month of lockdown that we've ever experienced in this, in certainly my existence. Online went from 22% of retail excluding fuels to 30% in 1 month. And guess who was behind that? And that is almost entirely Amazon, because Ocado, Waitrose, and so on refused to take any new clients for their grocery delivery services. So we had some supply side constraints there too. Amazon is in a position to become an absolute juggernaut as a result of the paradigm shift we were seeing in the UK. Online has sort of stagnated at about 20% of retail for about 5 years. And people, part of it was because retail was booming. So, level decline, increase in online. In fact, online sales fell, but the share rocketed. In my mind, I anticipate that in 2020, we will have an online share of retail in a range of 25 to 27%, given our perspective on the rest of the year in terms of level of retail sales and accessibility of physical retail space. That is a paradigm shift that only Amazon is equipped to surf. That's quite remarkable. I think this has made their lives a whole lot easier in relation to competition from multi-channel retailers. I think their survival is very, very much in question. Many pure play online players dabbled in verticals Amazon didn't dabble in, like fast fashion. They're finished. I think it's a time when the whole issue of marketplace, which, as you know, is under investigation in the United States and elsewhere, the sheer dependence of the consumer on Amazon has never been more salient.
Well, I think that's a really, really good summary of the economic position. Franklin, I wonder if I could turn to you. I mean, obviously, Amazon cares a lot about the numbers and its results, but it's also got other things that it cares about. It cares about the regulatory position that it finds itself in, and it cares about its overall reputation. And I wonder, I mean, you wrote about the tech clash as far back as maybe 2017, maybe even earlier. Do you think that in 2020, COVID-19 might offer Amazon the chance of a redemption in the minds of consumers and regulators?
I think that Bezos stumbled out of the gate in terms of response to the virus, in a couple of regards. One is Amazon's infrastructure, as vast and as well built as it is, was just simply not able to carry the demand that was placed on it by the virus. I mean, they've described themselves, or some of the tech companies have described themselves as a utility. Some of Amazon's critics describe it as a utility. And that function was on full display at the beginning of the virus, when it was the only means that people felt like by which they could acquire toilet paper and kind of the essentials for life. And so Amazon, Bezos, I think a lot of us kind of who both are, I'm a critic of Bezos and an admirer of him, an admirer of kind of what he has built, even as I'm terrified by it and think it needs to be constrained. And I, part of me wanted to see him step in and solve all of our problems. That if somebody understood how to manage a supply chain, it was Bezos. And what did we face? We faced these enormous supply chain problems when it came to masks and ventilators and the like. And instead of stepping in and playing a public role, he stepped in and he tried to make sure that the essentials of Amazon worked. And now, as we're kind of moving out of the first, whatever it is, the 2 months of lockdown, Amazon is pulling back the restrictions that they'd initially placed on purchases through Amazon Prime. They're shipping much more quickly. He was able to kind of, I think, very quickly step in and solve some of the just enormous logistics problems that Amazon faced. Now, the other thing, of course, is the warehouse workers, who were kind of these invisible figures in our system, and we've watched as they've been, outbreaks have occurred in Amazon warehouses, and that's put a certain other sort of pressure on Bezos, which he's been trying to get ahead of over the course of the last couple of years, as in the United States he's boosted minimum wage in Amazon warehouses. But that's an issue that's not going to go away for him until Amazon fully roboticizes its warehouses. But
do you think, Frank, on the warehouse employee point, I mean, we've spoken in terms of our investigation to multiple workers who at least allege that Amazon made a number of really big missteps in their response to COVID in relation to employees. You mentioned one of them, which is not starting off on the front foot. And from March to early April, it seems that there were masks that were lacking. The managers had very inconsistent responses according to which fulfillment center you worked in. And then you had the resignation of Tim Bray, the distinguished engineer at Amazon. And that marked presumably a moment when there was solidarity between Amazon's executives and their warehouse workers. And I'm interested to hear whether you think that will represent some momentum in terms of how Amazon's relationship with its employees, whether it would change for good.
So I think that Amazon recognizes that, first of all, it's one executive showed solidarity with its workers. It wasn't that there was a managerial caste within Amazon that suddenly was on the brink of revolt. But I think that this is, and I think, but it does represent this fissure that we see in other tech companies between kind of the rank and file engineers and management that you have, because the tech companies exist in kind of liberal, urban, cosmopolitan settings. You have engineers who don't want Amazon to work in league with the Pentagon or with the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. You have engineers who don't like the idea, or salespeople or whatever in Seattle who don't like the idea of their warehouses being portrayed as kind of the successor to Sinclair Lewis. Upton Sinclair and Sinclair Lewis. So I do think that this is a long-term problem for them. And, I think that the biggest problem that they face, which you alluded to, is that they're the subject potentially of congressional investigations in the United States and potentially antitrust action brought by either the Federal Trade Commission or the Department of Justice. And all of these optical questions ultimately influence their political position within Washington. And we just saw a Democratic presidential primary where candidates who used to inhabit what you would call the center left of the Democratic Party were joining the populists on the left to beat up on Amazon.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just before I turn to Zachary, I just wanted to reiterate, if you want to say anything at any point, then please put up your blue hand and I'll come to you after I ask Zachary. As an investor, do you, I mean, I don't know if you invest in Amazon personally, but if you were talking from the perspective of an investor, would you be concerned only with Amazon's results, the bottom line and the top line, in terms of its response to COVID? Or do you think that there are other factors that are relevant. Franklin mentioned the political factor. You had a position where you went from Bezos being called Jeff Bozo by Trump to Mike Pence thanking him publicly on Twitter for keeping supplies going during COVID. Is that relevant to how you see Amazon getting through COVID?
Well, first of all, Trump still hates Bezos, so I don't think COVID's changed that particular dynamic. Bezos still owns the Washington Post personally, which is extraordinarily against Trump, and Trump, in his infinite thin skin, certainly takes that personally. So I do invest in Amazon, but look, anybody, anywhere in the world who owns an index fund or a pension fund is likely invested in Amazon to some degree, just given their sheer size in global and US indices. So that's hardly, here or there. It's funny, at the beginning of all this, I would have kind of agreed with the general presumption that Alice laid out, and certainly Franklin has alluded to, that all of this is hypercharging Amazon's ability to outstrip its competition. And that ability certainly is going to come under regulatory friction, both in the United States and in the EU, and presumably at some point in Great Britain, post-Brexit Great Britain. But, its ability to function even with those frictions is probably unchallenged. What I think is very interesting over the past month or so is, and this is a question kind of about comparative strengths, is the degree to which multiple other players, given just the tsunami of need, and Franklin alluded to this, that Amazon itself was unable to meet this kind of surge of demand because it was unexpected, and they had been an incredibly efficient company. Efficient companies are efficient except when sudden need overwhelms finely calibrated supply chains and warehouses and delivery systems. And so you've had multiple other companies, whether in the United States, whether it's Target and Walmart, or pet delivery companies like Chewy, which is also, of course, in the UK. And Alice is totally right that initially that wave in the UK was unprepared as well and didn't take on new customers, but they've begun to be aware, whether it's Ocado or whether it's Mercado Libre in Latin America. In a strange way, while I don't think that Amazon is in any way, hurting, and it remains a leader in multiple respects, for better and for worse, there are now all these other companies. I've just talked about large ones and then small ones as well. I mean, in the book industry in the United States, because Amazon deprioritized book deliveries for 3 or 4 weeks, so you basically couldn't get a book for 4 weeks. Independent bookstores, there was something called bookshop.com, which was a platform that was very much an afterthought for independent bookstores, has seen literally a doubling and a trebling of volume, and independent bookstores are putting their inventories onto this so that they can then sell their books online with the same frictionless ease. So in a strange way, I think you're going to have a much more competitive online retail system, particularly as larger stores go out of business. Whether or not that will be bad for Amazon in the short term, I don't really know, but I'm much more attuned to how much this ecosystem of online, where Amazon was like the 18,000 pound gorilla, is now becoming a much more competitive space.
I'm gonna come to Alice in a second, because I see she has her hand up before turning to the floor. But Zachary, just on that point, these businesses like the independent bookstore took advantage of the fact that Amazon made a short-term change to not deliver books in a certain window. Now that things are getting back to normal, and you can get Amazon products in 2 days, in 1 day, even in 2 hours, will those changes stick, or will consumers just flood back to Amazon?
Look, no one knows the answer to that, and anyone who tells you that they do is pretending a certainty about future outcomes that are inherently uncertain. However, what a lot of these other platforms have done is be able to compete with what Amazon alone used to be able to do, which was the frictionless clicking and buying, which, I mean, that was a lot of the selling point, as well as you could get everything. So a lot of these other sites and a lot of these other, and that's true for Etsy as well, which has been, seen incredible booms because of this, which might have been through an Amazon marketplace before and is now, I mean, Etsy was a powerful platform before anyway. I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which people will use what's easy and use what they like. And, if they like supporting independent bookstores, I mean, that's a de minimis industry, even in the best of times. I'm just using it illustratively because we're all probably more higher concentration of readers than the general population. But I think in a lot of these places, it's going to be much more of a smorgasbord of options, of which Amazon will be one and a potent one. But I don't think Amazon, it's much harder to eliminate competition once it's proved itself to be viable. Amazon had a lot of this space kind of to itself.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Alice, you've got your hand up, which is great. What do you want to say?
You know, I believe that the regulatory pressure on Amazon is not affected by COVID-19 in the least, because even 30% of e-commerce, and let's say of online e-commerce, and let's just say Amazon, et cetera, 25%, it doesn't meet the threshold in the UK. The fact is that the Department of Justice, those people are distance working just like we are, and their life is spent on pursuing the vast umbrella investigation of all platforms in the US. I noticed that the Justice Department announced that the Google antitrust complaint would go ahead. As you know, the states are involved as well with damages. I would say this kind of looks like a juggernaut that's going to take, you know, I work here in the UK with people that are engaged in these regulatory issues, and that's all they're going to do. For them, Amazon, Facebook, Google, absent COVID-19, these regulatory issues are very live, and as they say, they occupy them, and they will not cease to occupy them. I would say in the UK that one should recognize that Amazon alone benefits from a beautiful regime which has been allocated to it in order to invest in warehouses and, as you say, minimum pay or living wage here now, as Amazon has been kind to give it to people. And all of that is all the business rates that we businesses like my business pay, Amazon doesn't pay. They built, every single warehouse they built in the UK has been fully subsidized by the UK taxpayer. It's been a gift to Amazon. I would surmise other governments are also facilitating Amazon in this way, whether it's in Brooklyn or wherever. I think it's about the pull of employment, and I think from the perspective of the issues you raised regarding the workers of Amazon, the fact that mass unemployment is already occurring in the US and will occur in the UK will pull more people into the Amazon employment system, as it could be called, with all the issues you raise. Unfortunately, I don't think anybody's really listening to those issues in the US, and certainly not in the UK with a conservative government.
Alice, do you think that you mentioned the issue of business rates, and certainly in the US, there's been quite a lot of coverage of Amazon not paying tax there. Not only do they not pay any federal tax, but I think that they've received about $3 billion in subsidies. Do you think as we come out of COVID and people become more aware that, you know, independent booksellers, you don't have to go across town to get an independent book, you can kind of click and collect in the same way as you did from Amazon, will Amazon kind of be forced into a position where it has to consider an offer more than just, you know, cheap price and fast delivery?
Do you know, many businesses in the UK don't buy Google search, and they are used, they crop up in the results organically, whether it's cafes, restaurants, or booksellers. I think the crucial issue is not about Amazon absorbing them, because I have worked with publishers over the last decade that have not found that experience as fruitful as direct physical distribution. And because, as you know, Amazon doesn't share the data on sale. I believe the independent bookshop, and as you know, in the UK, we're very, at the moment, okay, they're all shut. I agree, it's a heartbreak and all the rest of it. But the point is, those are destinations and have been for many years. And people don't forget them. And unfortunately, many of our local businesses have not been able to keep up with the emails from customers asking them to supply them with an alternative to a visit to a bookshop.
Okay.
Lots of alternatives that could come up, but they're not going to come from Amazon, not with its model.
That's really that. Okay, I want to bring in a couple of people from the audience. Catherine Simmons has her blue hand up. Is Catherine there?
Hello.
Catherine,
Yes, I am.
are you online?
Yes, I think so.
Are you one of the people that sees Amazon as a lifeline during COVID, or are you more suspicious?
On a personal level, I'm a bit more suspicious. I'm trying very hard to use my local shops, but I'm fortunate enough to live in part of North London that's got a lot of that. Where I'm really interested perhaps to see this conversation move a little bit more is towards the impact of Amazon Web Services, which I think is the most profitable part of Amazon, and is, whilst by no means a monopoly, and it does have some pretty big similar sized competitors in Microsoft Azure, Google, Alibaba.
I think the latest figures I've read were that Amazon Web Services is 2.5 times the size of its nearest competitor.
Oh, is it that much? I'm sorry, I'm by no means an economist. I'm an IT bod, and I brought this up, and the lady asked me to speak to it. But I think it's such a big. It's an area where Amazon must be making a killing right now, as so much has moved online. I believe some of Zoom, for instance, runs on AWS, probably not its real-time stuff, but it's back office. And that in itself, I mean, that's certainly something which makes Amazon a utility, I think, and one which should probably be regulated because there's a real existential risk around something going wrong with them, and half the country's processing is out, that kind of thing. And I just think this is a really this is a really interesting area that's rather different from the sort of consumer-based stuff we've been talking about so far. There's been quite a bit in the chat about it. I'd love to hear from Dom Tyler a bit more too, I think.
Okay, well, let's come to Dom, but I just want to ask Franklin about your point, Catherine. So AWS is fascinating because it's the profit driver of Amazon. It hosts, I think, 40% of the world's largest websites. Even the CIA use AWS. But as far as I can see, only recently have antitrust regulators turned their attention to AWS from the retail arm of Amazon. Do you think that there is a challenge to Amazon that can be mounted on an antitrust basis to its AWS wing?
I'm not, the theory of antitrust as practiced, at least in the United States, makes it probably pretty difficult to bring a case against AWS. I think one of the things, so I do think that there are many reasons to bring in the AWS example. Number one, I think AWS replicates a lot of the tactics that we see in the retail part of the business, in the way in which Amazon's dominance of the platform, and AWS is a platform, allows them to kind of keep building on that dominance, so that their data, they're kind of lock in as the way they lock consumers in, the way that they exploit their dominance to expand and to grow into other areas as they build apps on top of the AWS system is similar. Secondly, I think Amazon is just a unique company among the tech giants. So you do have Google, you do have Microsoft in the same sort of cloud computing space, but I think Amazon is just simply unique in that it's a tech company that invested in the development of its platforms and of the data and of the web interface, but it's also a company that's made incredible fixed cost investments over time. And part of the reason that it's been able to make the fixed cost investments that it's made in its retail business is that it's been subsidized by its incredible head start in the cloud computing business. And so cloud computing has allowed Microsoft to just keep building. So you get into a moment like this COVID crisis, Amazon is sitting on so much cash that when it needs to completely overhaul its supply chain and its warehouses and expand incredibly rapidly to deal with this unprecedented demand that it faces, it's able to make that move really quickly. And so, I mean, I think that, you know, they were hurt maybe for a month in the eyes of consumers, but they were able to recover so quickly and to go back to that same frictionless consumption that they once had. I think that they're actually sitting in an incredibly enviable position right now. That if you try to buy a book from an independent bookstore, the software is janky, the delivery times are ultimately going to be slower than Amazon, and so people are going to seamlessly shift back into an Amazon universe. But I think that the point is that Amazon is like the ultimate everything company, and that when we focus on retail, we're focusing on one small part, and not one small part of it, but a fraction of the company. And the computing part of it is the thing to pay attention to, and their advantage there. We could define it as a monopoly. Like 50 years ago in American antitrust, it would have been defined as a monopoly, and there would have been action probably taken against the company. But we've just shifted into a new regulatory regime, into this kind of what people just as crude shorthand called neoliberal regime, and there's no judicial doctrine for going after it now.
Zachary, I'd be really interested to know your perspective on AWS as not only an investor, but a historian as well, and someone that can kind of take a step back a bit. So AWS provides an infrastructure, and I suppose that you could say that Amazon Marketplace also provides an infrastructure. So here are two big examples of Amazon effectively providing a platform, but at the same time, obviously offering products and being a player in the game as well as the referee. Can you speak a little bit about this tension between, on the one hand, offering infrastructure, and on the other hand, selling stuff?
So I think Franklin alludes to this, and we might disagree a bit. The traditional antitrust structure, particularly in the United States, and then in many ways the current EU regulatory model, wasn't designed to deal with companies like Amazon, let alone Google. And so, vertically integrated monopolies were you had a gas station, and you also own the refiner, and you also own the wells, a la Standard Oil or some of these things in the early part of the 20th century. Or you were AT&T, you controlled the phone lines, but you also controlled the physical phones, and then you billed the customers. In something like AWS, right, there are a dozen or 15 large global competitors, and then there are dozens of more of kind of bespoke smaller ones. So Amazon is big, but so is Oracle, and so is SAP, and so is Alibaba, and so is Google Cloud, and so is Salesforce.com, and so is Microsoft Azure. And you're dealing with a much more decentralized, diverse global web hosting environment, where Amazon's reach in that respect is nowhere near what you would call a monopoly. The flip side is, like, antitrust and monopolies is an invented category at the beginning of the 20th century, right? It's a concept that then got regulated and defined. It wasn't a clear thing until it got regulated and defined. So you could if you are minded the way Franklin has alluded to, and others, to say, look, there's a de facto monopolistic control that's both anti-competitive to other companies that want to be involved, and anti-consumer, in either because it owns their data or deprives them of choice. You could create legislative and regulatory frameworks that addressed the nature of this entity, but trying to shoehorn them into early 20th century, and again, the EU basically just took those and added some bells and whistles, that was designed for industrial conglomerates or communications conglomerates in the 1960s, just doesn't work, right? Because it doesn't reach those thresholds. It's much more decentralized, and it is in fact still a much more globally competitive environment. So I don't know if that answers what you said, but
no, it's really interesting. And sorry to interrupt, but I think that I've read that you suggested that AWS should potentially break away from Amazon, and that might serve to satisfy some of the regulators' concerns.
I suggest that if you were going to break these things up, there are natural breaking points in a lot of these entities, and AWS is clearly one. I don't believe, by the way, that breaking up Amazon into its marketplace and AWS would do much for consumers or for consolidation, right? You'd still have a massive AWS, even if you severed it from marketplace. It wouldn't restore competition within the web service ecosystem. It just would make Amazon as a corporate entity less big. So that's why I think the regulatory framework is problematic. I personally don't believe that like 10 really large companies are necessarily more consumer friendly or market friendly than 2 or 3.
I mean, we're already almost 40 minutes into this conversation. We've discussed 2 divisions of Amazon, so there's only about 28 of them to go. Can I come to Nico McDonald? Is he around? Is he on? Can we get him on the chat? Hi, Nico. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Again, sorry about the motorbike. I just wanted to say the boycott thing. I think it's very interesting. Back in the 70s and 80s, which is when sort of boycotting movement started against South Africa under apartheid. Remember Jaffa oranges? Anyone? Back then, solidarity with workers in Amazon, which didn't exist, or their equivalents, took the form of joining a picket line or going on a TUC demo in Hyde Park, or some other active solidarity. And that's sort of been replaced by the idea that boycotting and us as consumers are the people who have power, rather than us as political activists or even workers. And no one ever reflects on whether boycotts work. Everyone thinks that us not eating Jaffa oranges brought down the apartheid regime, and ignores the fact that, black working class people in South Africa and, many thousands of activists there and in countries around South Africa probably did more damage by some way than are not eating Jaffa oranges. And I think it's a sort of fetish in a way of middle class professionals that that's how they can take action. And the other thing is, even if we were to boycott Amazon, what do we want Amazon to do, and how will it know that we want that? I don't think we even have a common purpose, if you like. That's my thoughts.
Is one of your points that if someone, from Islington, to just use a random example, decides not to buy anything from Amazon, that's not actually going to do that much? And if that is your point, what do you think we should be doing if we are concerned, for example, that warehouse workers at Amazon are not treated in the way that they should be?
Well, I think it's a really interesting challenge that some people, organizations are trying to deal with, is how you organize the unorganized, the precariat, the gig economy workers, and so on. And, something the Labour Party certainly hasn't managed to find a way to engage with. The truth is, I think we're still trying to work out a bit in the way that in maybe, the 1870s, we were trying to work out what it meant to organize, skilled and unskilled workers in the United Kingdom, and effective at that.
One of the things one of the impressions that I got from investigating this over the last couple of weeks and months is that employees of Amazon don't uniformly hate working at Amazon. You go on these private groups that were set up for Amazon employees and see a constant barrage of, this is awful, this is terrible. A lot of people appreciate Amazon for paying quite well, for hiring during recessions, and for generally being, in the context of a large organization, quite a good place to work. So I wonder, Nico, do you think that we're in danger of focusing on Amazon because it's a massive global conglomerate, when actually there are some good things about it as well?
I think there is a danger. I mean, anything high profile gets our attention. And I very much, I'm interested in your observation about Amazon. I think you can look at the situation with Uber drivers in the big debate about whether TfL, where they're licensed. Lots of well-meaning liberals said, it's terrible, these people aren't employed, and so on. But the reality is that suits a lot of people not to have, even 0 hours contracts has its merits in some ways. And I think the way that we see workers these days is not as people who have agency and intention, but as victims, very much in the way that we see people in the developing world. And I think that's the kind of fundamental root of this is, when you see people as victims, you don't have solidarity with them, you have sympathy, and that's not a way to build any sort of movement. But I agree with you that it's a we shouldn't impose our view of how people want to. Obviously, it would be desirable for everybody to have well-paid, good jobs and so on, but that won't be achieved by us boycotting Amazon.
Yeah, I think that's right. Can I come to Dom? Is it Tyler? Dom, are you here? Are you there?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. What's your take on Amazon?
I think we've obviously been talking a lot about how you talked about breaking them up with antitrust laws and the description of sort of an everything company. I think we're not really talking about how their size and scale is able to provide really quite significant benefit to people. So being able to have an Alexa device is a big thing for a lot of people, especially older people. My grandparents have one, and being able to not have to go online to do all their shopping, being able to just talk to the device and at the same time being able to make calls from it and so on, it's a really easy thing. We've spoken earlier in the chat about the Amazon Pay system, about even just the ability to load multiple cards onto your account. And obviously Amazon's trying to spread their pay infrastructure across the web as well. It's like there's so many synergies that they're able to provide to consumers that I wonder if we're maybe underplaying the amount that a large company with significant resources and engineering talent is able to tie all these disparate things together into a really useful product for their consumers.
Dom, can you at the same time as being admiring of Amazon also be concerned about them? Do the two things they don't have to be mutually exclusive, do they?
No, absolutely not. I personally don't have an Alexa device. I don't particularly trust Amazon as a company with my personal data. And I absolutely agree that that's an issue. But I wonder whether the idea that we need to break Amazon up is maybe become a bit of a sort of a buzzword thing. Like you can regulate data privacy while allowing a large company to exist. You can, through strong regulation, and obviously we can talk about tax as well, but I'd argue that a lot of the issues that we're seeing here are failures of government regulation rather than an issue with Amazon existing in the first place.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So you think that Frank, do you agree that there might be a middle ground between, not going so far as to break Amazon up and to keep its synergies and to keep Bezos's spirit of innovation and day one, but instead ameliorate some of its negative externalities through new laws? Zachary mentioned new anti-monopoly, antitrust laws. Do you think that that can satisfy some of the concerns that we're talking about?
Not really. I think it's possible. I do agree that, look, I agree that Amazon is an amazing company and there are kind of magical and wondrous things that it can provide. I do think that integration of kind of the system is part of that. But I don't, and I do think that it needs to be regulated. That if we're going to stick these kind of these devices in our kitchens, in our bedrooms, the fact that we don't have, at least in the United States, we don't have any real data protection law. I think that needs to be addressed. But I think that when we talk about the problems with Amazon, I think that there are two in particular that go back to the question of size. First is that you have the rest of the marketplace kind of views Amazon as an unavoidable force. And so if you're a company like Nike, you can try to exist outside of Amazon, but the way that Amazon crafts its system, it's basically unavoidable. That if you're Nike, you ultimately have to be on there. Amazon applies certain pressures on you that force you to come onto the market. And once you're on Amazon's market, the kind of gamesmanship that they play, and in terms of knocking off certain products or letting on gray market products, or the way that they manipulate the pricing system, means that you as a retailer or producer surrender a tremendous amount of control over Amazon. Amazon's always going to kind of rather arbitrarily make the decisions that are best for the Amazon system, and you have very, very little recourse. Maybe there are regulatory solutions to that. The second problem, which I think we're going to come to ultimately, is the core question with monopoly from the very beginning of time, when we started to talk about monopolistic firms, was that economic concentration would lead to political concentration, that economic power buys you political power. And a lot of the issue that I have with Amazon is that you have this company that I described as an everything company, but that even doesn't begin to capture the extent of its power. When you have the richest man in the world, who also owns one of the two most important newspapers in the United States, who is one of the most important movie producers in the United States, who's essentially leading the effort to go to explore outer space, who's assuming all of these functions that the government once run, who's housing the CIA's secrets, on his computers. And there's just a question that goes to the core of political economy and to the core of questions about democracy, about how much concentration of power are we willing to abide for the sake of efficiency and frictionlessness over time.
I mean, I think it's your point about Amazon expanding into the state is fascinating. I mean, you mentioned space, and obviously Bezos has kind of taken up the mantle of the state in trying to put humans into space. But you've also got his Earth Fund, which is him trying to solve climate change.
Yes.
You've got him retraining people, which is traditionally kind of a government task. I think you've got him trying to reform the American healthcare system, which is, obviously traditionally part of the state system. Claire, sorry, Alice Sanders, I got you mixed up with your your sister. Do you think that in the UK, Amazon is making a similarly aggressive push into the to the public sector? Is Alice may have gone. Is Alice there? It's a side effect of Zoom conferences. Zachary, let me come to you from a perspective of an investor. Would you want to see Amazon move more into the sort of industries that were traditionally carried out by government? Is there a kind of big fat potential profit there simply because government is inherently inefficient?
So first, one caveat: unlike many people who get identified with the moniker investor, I'm not interested in companies that are just good investments for the sake of them being good investments. I think there's I look at companies in terms of a whole ecosystem of effects, including what they can return to shareholders and what they also return to society. So I just want that understood. There's some people who might just look at Amazon or any other things purely in terms of its P&L and whether or not it's a good investment purely in terms of return. I've now forgotten.
You think Amazon does return something to society? You think Amazon is a kind of net benefit to society?
I think Amazon to this point in time has been more of a net benefit than not in terms of allowing for an ease of commercial transactions. And look, there's a whole other argument here about the death of big box and larger retail, particularly in the United States, where part of my sense is framed by the fact that I think the growth of car suburbs that had no zoning laws and were essentially spread out endlessly led to a kind of a generic, endless frontier of malls and strip malls in the United States more than most countries, by the way. That's not good for community and not particularly good for democracy. So the end of that, which was certainly hastened by Amazon and online retail, although there are other causes, I don't mourn in the least. And that's been, even more hastened by COVID. So that's part of my understanding, or part of my, where I see some of the positive benefit. And I actually think the end of that kind of big box world will allow for many more small businesses to thrive. And that's also true within Amazon Marketplace, and it's true within Etsy, and it's true within, individual small businesses now being able to sell their particular wares or services through larger platforms, which of course Amazon Web Service provides. The monopolistic stuff and the data stuff, I think, is a huge issue, although I think there are other players within that data ecosystem that are much more egregious. Weirdly enough, Amazon, because of Bezos's intense desire to control, keeps its own data for itself to use to build out its own ecosystem rather than selling it the way Facebook sells it or others. And to some degree, even the European GDPR is a little hobbled by a company like Amazon that tends to utilize its own data internally, albeit it does make it more difficult to collect it. So yes, I think Amazon has been better than not, which does not in any respect mean that I think it's been an unmitigated good, or that it doesn't, as Franklin says, it shouldn't be transparent, held to account, regulated in all the ways that any large structurally important entity needs to be, and which certainly in the EU, Amazon is, and to some degree, increasingly in the United States, although a lot of the regulatory focus right now in the United States has been on Google and Facebook and privacy more than it's been on Amazon and marketplace consolidation. That's really where the current arc is. I mean, we'll see if that changes post-COVID as Amazon becomes a much more visible aspect of everybody's lives. That tends to be a leading harbinger of regulation.
Thank you. Can we come to Daniel Dipper, because I think he's making quite an interesting point against breaking up Amazon.
Yeah, so what I raised was I think that we've kind of got to consider the message we send out when we look at these companies. So if we split up Amazon because we believe that it's too big, too powerful, well, actually that kind of sends out a message of if you're too successful, then the state will try to curb it, which I don't think is a good message to send out. So instead, what we've got to do is look at the regulation and strengthen that side of things, I think, if we want to kind of try and control the power or make sure they're looking after data properly or things like that. Because, as I said there, I do think if you kind of break it up, it doesn't encourage them to invest into new ventures, because there's always that thing of, oh, well, then the state could just simply take it, which is not what we want. And instead, what we need to look at is if we do want other competitors, like startup funding, and also trying to kind of level the playing field as such, looking at, for example, the tax issues. I know there's issues with the digital tax, but that's something we really need to kind of hammer out to try and make it a bit more fair when competing like the high street as well.
Daniel, do you think, though, that kind of paradoxically, Amazon without regulation or Amazon without being broken up might have so much power that it would prevent innovation, that it would prevent the sort of startups that you want to see emerging?
I think there is a small risk of that because of the fact that if they have enough money, then technically they could kind of just buy out all of these startups, which would kind of stifle the innovation we're looking for. But I think, once again, it's where we do look at regulation and possibly not actually breaking them up, but kind of limiting the amount they can provide, or even looking at something I just thought about now, but I'm not sure how it apply. A lot of broadcasters have like a public service obligation which they have to fulfill, and actually maybe we need to consider, if they become that sort of larger provider, if actually maybe we need some sort of public service obligation they have to fulfill as well.
That's really interesting. We've been talking so much about breaking up Amazon or not breaking up Amazon. I really want to get a sense of the people here, whether you all think that Amazon should ultimately be broken up. So if you think Amazon should be broken up, can you please put up your blue hand? And if you think Amazon should not be broken up and can perhaps be constrained through less extreme measures, then keep your hand down. And perhaps Liv, who's on the call, if you could tell me whether you think, what you think the results are, because I can't easily see them on my screen. It seems like most people, though, just scrolling down, don't want to see Amazon broken up. One person that does, though, had his hand up before. So can we go to David Zell, and you can tell us why you think Amazon should be broken up?
Just a minute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. No, the hand was up because of something, because of another comment, something else I wanted to talk about, which is about the environmental challenges of Amazon's delivery model, and the fact that they haven't made a commitment, as far as I know, to any major electrification objective worldwide. So, like others here, I'm a massive user of Amazon, because of the gratification aspects of Amazon Prime, particularly now when I'm sheltering as a grandparent here in Islington. So I tick those boxes. But seriously, I'm very worried about the fact that there are vans drawing up every other day that are petrol driven or diesel driven. And this is a basic issue with all online fulfillment at the moment.
David, can I just put your point? Can I just put your point very quickly to Franklin? When I was working on Amazon, it's the second Tech Nation series. The first one we did was Apple, and what you can see from Apple was that it started off very, very focused around product under Jobs, and then expanded into more of a purpose-driven company under Tim Cook. Amazon seems to be at the stage now, even though it's older, even though it's 20 odd years old, 26 years old, it seems to still be at the stage where the product or the consumer is its kind of laser focus. And do you think it's just starting to make inroads into feeling concerned about the environment, realizing that sustainability is important? Can you talk about how it might transfer from a consumer focused company to a wider purpose-driven company?
Right. Well, I think, being a retail company, and retail is a business where, unlike Google search engine or Facebook social media company, advertising business, the margins are so thin, and that cultivates kind of a different sort of ethos. And the commitment to the customer that Amazon has, which I think is like the source of a lot of appreciation in the audience, and kind of rightly so. I mean, I know I feel that myself. Even as a critic, I'm a relentless user of Amazon myself, and I'm quite dependent on it. I think, though, as Bezos has amassed wealth, and as Amazon has amassed power, and it kind of sits atop the economy in the way that it does, it has political considerations. And in 2013, Bezos wrote a famous memo called Amazon.love. And he looked at the corporations around the world that were not loved, the Exxon Mobils, the Goldman Sachs, and he posed the question to his executives: what would it take for us to stay in the loved camp as opposed to the unloved camp? And I think that has begun a series of maneuvers on his part to go from being somebody who was kind of more extremely libertarian to somebody who was willing to put profit aside, at least momentarily, for better optics, and to perform more of a civic role. So that leads him to buy the Washington Post and to cast himself as a savior of American journalism. That leads him to take some of the initiatives that we've described in healthcare, or space, or even, I think, in climate, where they've made a commitment to be carbon neutral, I think by the year 2030. Is that right, Alexi?
I think, yeah, that sounds about 10 years before they have to.
And so in a time when government is kind of dysfunctional in the United States and in the UK, I think it's very, you have this, I think, greater willingness to invest public functions in private companies. And Amazon, as a concern, is just an emblem of competence. They get, in a time when things are broken, they get the package to you, usually as promised, and they do it so consistently that means that we're willing to invest greater public trust and responsibilities in a figure like Bezos, in a company like Amazon. And, you know, in my view, it's understandable why we do this, but I would rather be fighting for an improvement of some of these public functions rather than just waiting for beneficent private sector leaders to step in and solve our problems for us.
Thank you very much. And I can see that it's 1 minute past our hour. So unfortunately, we've got to wrap up this absolutely fascinating discussion. It's kind of no wonder that we felt rushed given the scale and the scope of Amazon. I'm just going to sum up very briefly some of the points that were made. We started off looking at COVID, and I think the consensus here is that despite Amazon stumbling initially out of the blocks, it's going to emerge stronger from this pandemic. E-commerce is going to explode as more and more people discover the convenience of shopping online, and Amazon, as the biggest player in that space, is going to be the greatest beneficiary. However, there are concerns within that about how Amazon has treated its employees, its relationship with its employees, and what, in fact, as consumers, if we are concerned about employee treatment or about Amazon in general, we can do. I think Nico made a really good point that simply not buying Amazon for a week or two, or however long you can cope without Prime, isn't going to do much. So maybe it's a question for regulators. If they don't want to break Amazon up, what can they do to ensure that employees' rights are safeguarded? I think on the regulation point, whether we should break Amazon up, that was obviously the central question. COVID, even though it might improve Amazon's stance in the minds of politicians, that's not going to make these big regulatory questions on both sides of the Atlantic go away. It is a company that offers both infrastructure and a product, and that is an inherent tension that might lead it into trouble. But I really like some of the points that were made by Daniel. There is a danger in breaking up a company like Amazon, because what message does it send? And I think Dom's point about it being a knee-jerk reaction to break up Amazon was also interesting. Perhaps we should be looking elsewhere before we go down that path. You know, looking forward into the future, there is a tension between Bezos applying his efficiency and his genius to areas that were traditionally occupied by the state. On the one hand, it'll make everything a little bit more efficient, but on the other hand, how much power are we actually diverting into the hands of a private individual? And the sheer amount of data that Amazon is collecting on each and every one of us. We didn't talk about this, but through surveillance cameras, through Alexa, and through its retail arm, not to mention AWS, that is soon going to outstrip any of the other tech giants. So there's lots of stuff to think about. We'll take it away, and do have a look at our investigation next week, because it deals with some of these questions. It just remains for me to say thank you very much to all our guests tonight, and to you. It's very thought-provoking, and we can't clap each other out, but we can wave each other goodbye. So thank you, and come again. Bye-bye.